This is the Brackin Krueger cast, the official podcast of Brackin Krueger Games. Season 1, Episode 16, Burning Wheel. Hello friends, welcome to another episode of the Brackin Krueger cast. I'm Chris Krueger and I'm joined today by Adam Doc Brackin.
Hey everybody.
And today we're starting kind of a mini-series on the games that have influenced us, specifically games that influenced the Roll With It system. But Burning Wheel is a game by Luke Crane. Came out, I think, sometime in the 90s, right, originally?
No, not really.
Maybe developed in the 90s and came out in the 2000s.
I mean, it has a really interesting backstory. But basically, it was very iterative in its design. And by the time we get to the gold edition, which was more like 2010, 2012, it had been rigorously tested by huge fans. Mm-hmm. And I will say that it is a masterwork. By the time it reached the gold edition, it was a masterwork.
I would agree.
But it also has lots of supplementary material, especially if you go into like the monster burner and various world burners and things like that. And not only that, but it's also been spun off into a sort of a space setting as well. It's a very specific one, but there's a lot to be said for the Burning Wheel and the wiki and also the community that surrounds it. Way more than I could ever possibly describe in our short podcast.
So Burning Wheel, actually remember, was one of the 3 games that we covered when I took the class that you were teaching on the history and design of role-playing games.
Yes.
We were kind of looking at 3 main systems that each of the students was required to create a character in and that we ran a session in.
Yes.
And
I did a one-shot.
There was kind of like a spectrum of sorts. And this is before I feel like, at least that we were aware of kind of like the crazy world of indie games as we know them today.
Well, it didn't exist as we know them today back then, frankly.
I think moves were being made at the time, but they weren't prevalent enough for us to have heard of them.
Right. Well, no one was making a career out of it. How about that? It was a side hobby.
I'm not sure if many people are still,
well,
but
fair enough.
It does exist, I suppose. Anyway, point being that we had kind of this spectrum of the story light, crunch heavy system of D&D, and then the story heavy, comparatively low crunch system of Burning Wheel. Now, by my standards today, I would probably still call Burning Wheel pretty crunchy, but in obviously a very different way. And we'll get into that here in just a minute.
Well, actually, I'm not sure that's entirely accurate in terms of my goals for for that class when I originally designed that, because I picked Burning Wheel for the class before you and I even met. So, I think back in those days, I was using GURPS. And one of the reasons why I was using GURPS was because you could do anything you wanted with it and it was open-ended. So I don't know that my goal was ever to get away from mechanics in that sense. And I certainly would never call Burning Wheel mechanics light. It has the potential to be. And that, I think, was the key there, is that you could choose, let's call them alternate mechanics, because there's a lot of alternate mechanics. Like there's a complex fight mechanic, but then there's also like, hey, just roll one die and be done with it mechanic. And then even beyond that, you could almost do it like a diceless system. I've said this before. You can run Burning Wheel as diceless. And really, even before you get to any of those mechanics, there's the beautifully, beautifully elegant system of life paths and creating a character with life paths, which is frankly like its own game. It's almost like a single player afternoon delight. And
that's definitely the most fun character to build in that assignment.
And you aren't going to do your first one, you aren't going to do that in more than, or I should say in less than like 40 minutes to an hour and a half or more.
Yeah. Even if you know what you're doing, you've done it before.
My record's about 20 minutes to create a character for Burning Wheel.
Yeah, and if you're going through it for the first time and like reading the book and seeing all the steps to do it and trying to like wrap your head around it, it's very complex. Yeah, but
it's a weekend.
So very worth the effort though, because that's one of the things that I still love about that system, and that I remember some of my early designs, I tried to incorporate some sort of life path-esque system. If it wasn't necessarily life paths, it was something to do with deriving your character's present day stats from their background.
Yeah.
And I just loved that system of how different life paths were this many years of your character's life, and there were like prerequisites, and there were like you had to be in a certain setting, and there was only certain things that can move you from one setting to another. That being, for example, say, just being like a poor peasant over here versus being in the military or being a noble, that sort of deal.
You can't just be a knight. You have to have been, born into it and have done the right training and gone to the school and had the master and done the training
or something like that.
Which means you're not going to be a knight before the age of like 24, 25 mechanically within the context of the system. And then you might, I don't know, commit a crime and become an outcast or a pirate or something like that. And just that, before you even sit down to roll a die, that idea of having a prepackaged backstory to work into your character, it's like getting to know a character. Now, I'm not real huge on the idea of creating a character before you sit down to write a book or something like that. But there is a sort of cheat sheet that I use whenever I want characters for novels and that kind of a thing. I made it myself, and it doesn't have any stats in that sense. But what it does have is sort of likes and dislikes and catchphrases and that kind of thing that I can consult 6 months later when I was like, what was my character concept for this this I don't know, priest or random stranger that I came across, that kind of thing. And so for my main characters, I do this, and I got to say that inspiration came from that life path system from Burning Wheel, very specifically, and even more so to do with some of the other let's call them mechanical cheats that are in the system. And I know you really like these, so I'm gonna let you give your impression.
So that was one of the things that stood out to me about this, because another one of the sort of the middle ground system, if you will, was we played Serenity, which was Cortex. And this was like old Cortex, not Cortex Plus like we have now.
Right.
And what was kind of cool about that one is there's a point buy system for getting different character aspects. So that could be, and you would maybe like if you took something negative, you could get extra points to put toward other things. And so some of these are almost like kind of mechanical benefits, like you're extra skilled at this thing, and so you get this bonus to these sorts of roles. And some of them are actually like personality things where, for example, I think you could have a rival or something like that, where depending on whether it was like a minor or major version of that thing, you would have either like a bigger rival or someone who shows up to cause problems for you more often, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so while that was really interesting, what Burning Wheel does is it gives you a little bit more of an open-ended thing that has both a direct mechanical effect and also kind of guide your character moving forward. And so beliefs are a number of statements you make about your character, and they have a very prescriptive way that they want you to write these. It has to be specific, and it has to have a clear, it can't just be like, oh, I believe that the king is bad. It has to be something more like a clear goal that you have. So I am going to usurp the king and take the throne for myself, or something like that.
Or I will avenge the death of my father, very Inigo Montoya style.
And so that also kind of, it can potentially build into your backstory or be derived from it. It could also be something kind of unrelated to that. And your beliefs can actually change throughout the game, which is another really great aspect of it. Instincts are also something very interesting, where
those are my favorite.
You have a number of instincts that are, and I think this is derived from the kind of player versus GM mentality, if you want to call it that, of other sort of dungeon crawl fantasy games, where players might feel taken advantage of by the GM for like, oh, did you remember to
load your crossbow?
Yeah, that sort of thing. It's like, well, you never told me you did it, so I'm going to say that you didn't do it. So instincts are kind of like a player's way to counteract that.
Yeah.
Where it's like, my crossbow is always loaded.
Right.
Or if there's danger nearby, I always wake up, that sort of thing. Like kind of the things you want your character to like not have to worry about.
Yeah, it's a way to cheese a little bit in an advantageous way for your character that has always been a pet peeve of yours or bugged you. That's a terribly cynical way to describe it.
Or even if you want to be like have a little bit of fun with it, it can be something like, I always have a pipe and tobacco on hand. Or something
there
like
you
that,
go. That's a much better way to say it. For me, to use the crossbow example, one of the greatest characters I ever enjoyed playing was exactly that. And he just, because of the way the mechanics work with turns and everything, it's like 18 actions in order to reload your crossbow. And so what I would do is I would use him as a one-shot wonder. And that's literally what he was, is that whenever the fight would break out, he would have the crossbow ready and he could aim for the biggest, baddest target, and then he'd draw his sword. And so that's the way I played that character. And it was a lot of fun for me because then I could still be in the fight and still be the guy that I wanted to be with the crossbow in hand. And I one-shotted an ogre between the eyes one time because we were playing in the Lord of the Rings Second Age using Burning Wheel, which, by the way, is a really, really great pastiche. I mean, it fits perfectly. You've got orcs, you've got men, you've got elves, you've got dwarves.
Yeah, I think it was strongly inspired by, like, they took
very much
they went their own way with it, but you could definitely tell that there's a lot of Lord of the Rings influence on the setting.
And that's an important distinction because, Dungeons and Dragons was directly derived from Lord of the Rings as well. But for it to be a one-off and to say that that Burning Wheel was somehow inspired by Dungeons and Dragons, which was inspired by Lord of the Rings, would be incorrect because that would be derivative at that point, and it is not. In fact, it is in many ways truer to the Lord of the Rings and the sort of the Tolkien verse than one might critically and honestly be able to say that Dungeons and Dragons is anymore, because it has become its own lore that is deep and very, very old.
And I think that there's a certain philosophy about the type of world that you're in that comes through and either the descriptions of the life paths and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
For example, one that stands out to me is there's actually a life path you can take as a human. I think the orcs might also have this. I'm not positive which races all have this, but you can start off with a slavery background,
right? Like
having been a slave.
That's true.
And what is interesting about that is that he very specifically states, and at one point there's actually a questionnaire that's supposed to determine your constitution and that sort of thing, your willpower, other things along those lines. And so you're answering these questions, yes or no. Has your character ever done this or been injured or whatever the case might be? And was your character at any point a slave? And that's actually a detriment. And so he talks about the trope of, like, a slave, like, learned, like revolution tactics or learned how to be like stubborn and resistant and fight the man. And that's kind of like the trope that we tend to see in, like, a lot of like old films and stuff like that. But what they emphasize is that to be a slave, especially in this world, is to be broken and to be unhealthy and to be potentially mentally weak because you've like lived your whole life kind of being oppressed like this.
And it affects your mechanics if you go that path, which is really interesting.
You don't gain as many like stats going forward. Like, for example, if you're a life path might give you like +1 mind and +1 body, which you can then distribute across the relevant stats. Being a slave might give you like +1 mind or body, or maybe just +1 body or something like that, compared to something that might be like an equivalent sort of power at that point in your character story.
Yeah, and your overall resilience and other things are going to be, suffer for it. What I really like about the overall philosophy of the system, to me, is that you can be as crunchy or not crunchy as you want to be. The very first time I ever played it, I was going to be an orc and I was going to be a part of a human party. And the GM just kind of looked at me and said, "You really can't do that." And then he's like, "Well, okay, yeah, technically you can, but I don't think you realize what you're saying." And it was that they freed me from slavery, and yet at the same time, I was never fully part of the party. They nicknamed me Pooflinger, which was not heroic.
Rather disrespectful.
Let's put it that way. But it was completely appropriate for the story we were telling, and it was I would say an RPG life-changing experience. It was not a truly life-changing experience. It was a game. I know the difference between reality and such, but it changed the way I play all games from that point, if that makes sense. It was the first time I truly transcended over into, wait a minute, this is not just a simulation dungeon crawl. This is a story of a deep, deep telling, and I'm the Gollum character. Oh, okay, interesting. And that was one of the core reasons why I wanted to teach the RPG class at the university level, is to get that message across to the students and say, listen, this is not just about designing a mechanic. This is about designing a storytelling experience, whether that be in a computer space or not. The fundamental principles are going to be the same. And I think that over the course of the 5 or 6 times that I taught that, and then we taught that, we succeeded. We definitely had some high compliments at the end there, and I'm proud of it. So I would say I owe a debt of gratitude to Luke Crane for that and for incorporating that into his philosophy and into Burning Wheel, which, as I said, is one of my absolute favorites of all time ever. And it's not just because it's a good system; it's because of that core philosophy.
So with all that being said, even though there is a very particular philosophy that comes across and a certain feel that comes across in the setting that they sort of give you, it's also a generic setting. So it's a generic fantasy setting. It's not as generic as, say, a GURPS where you can play anything, anyhow. But
an important distinction, but you're right.
Yeah, but you can also kind of make your world your own.
Yes.
It doesn't give you a prescribed thing that says, here are the societies of this world, and here is how this culture tends to operate and that sort of thing. It is all very much open-ended, and so you can adapt into a lot of different things.
Right.
So I know you already mentioned, we've talked about, we did Lord of the Rings at one point. I've seen it played a number of different ways, and some people kind of maybe taking some liberties with interpreting, say, like swords and other stuff like that, maybe like changing the words those are attached to and playing completely unfantastic settings.
Right.
The other thing that's really great about it too, and this ties into the way that I think the mechanics and the way that you build your character is really trying to make the character the driver of your story, which is something that has always kind of like been in up until this point. When this game came out, was always kind of an optional thing. You could choose to put a lot into your character and to have your character have this great motivation and do all this great stuff, but it was always because you, the player or the GM, took initiative to make that happen. This system was built around that idea, and each of the races had this really cool sort of like special stat that was different for each one.
Except for the humans, those poor humans.
Well, they had faith, which was like kind of the equivalent of their magic, or a sort of magic.
I stand corrected. You're right.
And so, but like that was kind of an optional one. You had to have like taken gifted in order to get that.
Yes.
And you can only get gifted by taking particular life paths.
That's right.
So, again, the life path system is so great. Like that's how you unlock different skills and all this different stuff. But
it's almost like a study unto its own to figure out how you can get to that 5th life path you're aiming for. It's fun.
And so one example of these is the Elvish system, Grief.
Oh, yes.
And so elves are comparatively very overpowered to other characters in kind of the same way that the original Dungeons & Dragons had very powerful elves.
It's a very unbalanced system, and it works better because of it.
Yeah. But the elves also have this like kind of this emotional stat of grief where there's certain triggers that they list in the book where each time this happens, you have to basically roll to see if your grief count goes up. And if you get up to a certain point, your character either dies of grief or they sail into the west or whatever else you want to sort of say they do. Orcs have hatred, which works in a very different way. Dwarves have greed that works in a very different way.
Yeah.
And so you kind of like have this sort of special cycle that will happen to your character based on what happens during the story, which is really, really cool.
Yep. So in that sense, you're not just playing as a group, you're also playing a personal story of your character and the evolution of your character within the context of the character you've created. I think it's also important to say that the way that leveling works, there is no character level in Burning Wheel, but every single stat, and I mean literally every stat, you have a way of tracking every time you try something. And it's not about succeeding and it's not about failing. It's about the level at which you tried to do it.
The level of challenge.
Yeah, the level of challenge is a good way to say it. And so that, again, was revolutionary because what it meant was if you're really pushing yourself in swordsmanship, you're going to get better at swordsmanship. But until then, you're going to have to take the swings as they fall, so to speak. But on that same token, you know, any stat or really any skill that you're doing, whether that be lockpicking or, just listening, you're going to need to work at it in order to get better.
What this kind of leads to is these characters feel like living, breathing characters.
Yeah, they really do.
Whatever systems were in place to simulate things were all very kind of believable systems.
Yeah.
That led to this really great sense of emergent narrative.
Emergent is the word I was thinking of. Yeah. Well, and when you compare that to something more traditional, where you earn XP and then you level up a stat, you can kind of fudge it and go, I know I didn't swing my sword at all, but my swordsmanship's so terrible that I want to go ahead and level that up. And you kind of abstract that out in another system. But you can't abstract anything out in Burning Wheel. And that level of detail, the attention to that level of detail, I think for a lot of people is going to be tedious and just not enjoyable. But for someone like myself, it actually made it meaningful. And because it plugged in to that why of why I am doing a thing, it became incredibly enjoyable. So yeah, what else is there to say about Burning Wheel?
This is something we've mentioned before on the cast, which is to paraphrase the caveat that they put at the very end of the book, that is to say, don't use this book. They have lots of systems in place if you want to address the book to see what it says about how the system wants you to do X, Y, or Z. But I think there's also a philosophy in there of not bogging the game down with the mechanics. Unless you have to. And
there's a super complicated and really interesting way that fight mechanics can work. But in a similar fashion, there's also a super complicated and interesting duel of wits mechanic, which is like for debate, where it's like, strike, counter strike, point, counterpoint, that kind of thing. The parallels there are beautiful, but you don't have to use them. You should when it's right, but you shouldn't when it's not. And there's still just the way that you can do a simple roll. You can even do a simple fight mechanic, or you can do just a one-off.
If I recall correctly, the simple fight mechanic is you look at your weapon skill that you're using versus the opponent's weapon skill. You assign from that dice pool, which it's a dice pool system.
It is, yeah.
Say if I've got a skill of 4 in my axe, I can assign 2 dice to defense and 2 dice to offense. And if the opponent gets any successes on their attack, my defense can cancel that out. If they break through my defense and that way they have more successes on their attack than I was able to cancel with my successes on defense, then I take damage and vice versa. And then you decide what that means. Once you get to the point of I took.
Yeah, narratively. Ultimately, it always comes down to narratively. And I think that's the reason why the disclaimer exists in the book, so that it's like, listen, guys, this is not meant to slow your game down. This is not meant to trip you up. This is tools for you to tell a really cool, intricate story at the level of granularity you want to. If that doesn't work for you, don't roll till you have to. And I think that's one of the core principles and philosophies that we have adopted in Doc and Krueger, is that idea of, make this your own. As far as the other ideas from that we consider to be inspirations for us, I think that we could point really easily to the life path system, especially with the roll with it system, and how we took motifs. And it's a much more simple way of looking at that. We don't have those prescribed; it's open ended. But we trust the players to be able to come up with their own motifs in that regard. And as we're working on different settings and things like that, we'll give some suggestions for that within certain settings. But still, what it comes down to is we love that idea of being able to create a backstory mechanically as a way of creating a character. And so that's one of the things that we've adopted. Another thing that I think we've adopted is this idea of characters having beliefs and, having the way to sort of mechanically change things with who they are and what they are, not just the stuff they have and the stats they have. And so it's like turning it inside out and flipping it on its head.
We barely touched on, like I mentioned, that beliefs can change over time, but to very, very briefly summarize how that works, you get to a point where you either need to abandon your belief because you don't actually believe it anymore, or you've kind of accomplished the goal in that belief.
That's right.
And then it goes away and you need to come up with a new belief.
Yeah, that's right.
And that kind of drives your character's personal motivation. And that's something that is definitely a big inspiration for us.
Well, that's super similar to the way that we use, epiphanies and abandonments in the roll with its system, even though the beliefs themselves are a little bit different. I think that you could say that there's an unstated belief behind every motif, and that comes together in the creation and of a character as an emergent property, to use that phrase again. And so in that regard, I would say that there are some spiritual connections to the Burning Wheel system and to Luke Crane's masterpiece.
definitely one of those like all-time classic RPG systems that I think that if you're interested at all in studying design and learning more, even if you don't find yourself emulating the system all too much, I think it's definitely one that ought to be studied as a sort of a fundamental work.
Yep, it's not for everybody
in our field,
but boy, everybody should know it. Yeah.
Well, thank you, one, for joining us for Season 1, Episode 16, our talk on Burning Wheel and how it influenced the Roll With It system and our design philosophy in general. I'm Chris.
I'm Doc.
And we'll see you next time. The Doc and Krueger cast is a production of Doc and Krueger Games, jointly hosted by Adam Doc Brackin and Chris Krueger. The theme music was composed by Nick Krueger. The Roll With It system is available now. You can find it and our other games through our website, docandkrueger.com.